Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Varun Sriram with UCAN, and we've got an amazing webinar discussion here today. We are talking about how to unlock your endurance potential, fueling strategies for runners, and we've got a star-studded crew led by Dakotah Popehn, U.S. Olympian in the marathon. Dakotah just is coming off running the Paris Olympics last year, ran the New York City Marathon last year. She's currently training for Boston. Dakotah, absolute pleasure to have you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks. I'm really excited to be on, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's great to have you here. Dakotah's joined by Bob Seebohar, a sports dietitian and endurance athlete himself out of Colorado. Bob is the former sport dietitian for the U.S. Olympic team, works with a wide range of athletes. He's worked with top level athletes, works with age group athletes. Bob, thank you so much for being here as well.
Oh, it's a pleasure as always, Warren. Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, we got Coach Greg McMillan, top running coach. Greg's coached thousands, hundreds of thousands of athletes, maybe to marathons, from first-time marathon runners all the way up to Olympians. Greg's been a frequent guest of ours on these sessions as well. Greg, it's great to have you back.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Well, before we dive into the meat of today's discussion, which we really are going to center today's conversation around fueling for runners and all the different things that go into it, probably a lot of kind of hot button questions and topics that you guys have been hearing about if you're navigating social media for information in terms of carbs per hour and is more better. We're going to get into all of that stuff. But before we do get started, I just want to give each of our guests a little bit of a chance to introduce themselves and tell you all a little bit about how they got into this world of running. So, Dakotah, we'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got started in the sport of running, and kind of what you're currently doing today in running.
Yeah, so I started running when I was a freshman in high school. I grew up in Minnesota, and like a true Minnesotan, I grew up playing hockey. You betcha. So when I was a freshman, my mom just kind of saw that I was really wrapped up in hockey and just felt like I needed to broaden my horizons. And I went out for running because I typically beat the boys in gym class, and I thought in the mile. And so I thought, I'd be pretty good at this little sport. And it turns out I was not very good off the get-go. I took last a lot my freshman year of high school, and just kind of fueled my fire to be a better runner. So that was kind of just how I got started, and then eventually went on to be a walk-on at a Division II college. And my Division II college coach just felt like, wow, she could really crush a marathon based on how I would run my long runs. And so he prompted me to try out for the Olympic trials and in the marathon in 2020. And I went on to do that, took, I don't know, like 38th or 36th that year. And 4 years later, went on to make the Olympic team.
Amazing, amazing. Well, we're really glad to have you here. I think love the story of how you got started in the sport as well, and excited to hear your insights over the course of this next hour or so. Bob, we'll jump over to you. What is your journey into the world of sports nutrition and endurance sports?
So endurance sports, I grew up actually a soccer player and a basketball player. So I was kind of abruptly introduced to triathlon in my undergrad and failed horribly in swimming and biking and running because I just wanted to sprint the whole time. And that was a harsh introduction. At the same time, I was making the convert from short course triathlon to long course triathlon, so more half Ironmans and Ironmans. And this is, I think, what set off my entire career because I was plagued with the infamous GI distress monster quite early in my shift from team sports, mostly anaerobic, to aerobic, and kind of have dealt with the GI distress monster early in my career. And I think that's really what shaped why I do what I do. And I want to really help athletes not only improve their performance, but also improve their digestive health also.
Wonderful. Well, I think there's a lot of athletes in here that are interested in both of those things. So great to have you, Bob. And finally, Greg, for yourself, you've been coaching runners, specifically coaching runners in the marathon, but all distances for many years. How did you get involved in the sport of running yourself, and how did you get to being a coach?
Yeah, similar to Dakotah, started running in high school, fell in love with it, ran in college, really fell in love with it, studied exercise science. And, when you have those two things and you like helping people, you naturally move toward being a coach. So wouldn't say it was planned, but it just sort of happened from the passion of wanting to figure out how to be better at the sport we love. And I've been super lucky over the last 35 years to coach everyone from new runners just coming off the couch or out from behind the computer, age groupers, national champions, and Olympians. So it's been fun to work with everybody and see the similarities and the differences, but mostly to help them from where they are to where they want to get. That's a really rewarding profession for me.
Excellent. Well, you guys have all given a lot to the sport of running, and these sessions are really, really valuable to pull people together with so much experience to be able to shed light on such important topics like fueling for runners, which really is so fundamental to having success, as a runner, right? And it's interesting. There's kind of being in my role with UCAN and talking to a lot of runners over the last decade plus, it's always never kind of ceases to amaze me where people think about so many things, the shoes, the gear, so many of the logistics, but oftentimes you might come into a big race and you haven't really practiced or thought about your fuel as much as you've thought about these other things. And fueling is so fundamental to, having a good race, being able to train well, being able to hit your goals. Bob, starting kind of off with you on this topic of fueling, like when you're working with runners, what do they need to consider kind of most importantly when it comes to how to fuel around their activity, before and let's really, because we can really go wide with this if we're talking about nutrition as a whole, but let's kind of nail it down for this discussion to fueling around activity. Like what should runners think about when it comes to fueling before, during, and after a run?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at that nutrient timing window, if we will, so it's that window usually encompasses about 2 to 3 hours before a run, during a run, and then about an hour or two after a run. So if we're looking at that window, that's really what we're focused on. But and I'll say this probably quite a bit throughout, it really depends on context, right? So we can't classify like a 5K runner with a marathoner, right? We can't classify a recreational runner to an Olympian because there are different logistics. And we know like Dakotah has a little bit different physiology than you and I and Greg have, right? So she is able to do different things nutritionally than we are able to do because we know that from research that elite athletes can actually tolerate and expend different types of macronutrients at different rates. So first thing, I always like to classify what is your competitive level. So are we recreational? Are we age group like top age group? Are we professional, elite, Olympic? That's the first thing. The second thing is obvious, the distance, right? What distance am I doing? Because sometimes, like if you're training for a 5K, 10K, maybe we don't need to get too much in the weeds with our nutrient timing system. Maybe we just focus on meals or snacks. But certainly, once we get above, I'm going to give two criteria here. During our workouts, if we have workouts that are about 2 hours or longer, or about 60 to 90 minutes that are high intensity workouts. So think hill repeats, track workouts, right? That's when we need to start fueling because that's when our body really needs it. So the first qualification is over 2 hours, a little bit longer. So think of like zone 2-ish or a little bit shorter with more zone 3, 4, and maybe some 5. So those are the first couple qualifications to think about. And then, I mean, we can get into the weeds in terms of breaking each one down, but that's like the 30,000 foot view.
Excellent. Dakotah, when you hear that as a professional runner, like what types of workouts do you think about proactively fueling for versus what types of workouts are you going into kind of just thinking like, hey, if I've eaten a meal within a reasonable window, then I'm not thinking specifically about fueling for this workout.
Yeah, it kind of it depends on where I'm at in training. I would say when I'm in my marathon training like I am now, almost every workout I'm trying to be really thoughtful about making sure that I'm fueling really well before. You can kind of get away with less when your intensity and your volume's not as high, I feel like. But specifically for me, thinking about long runs right now, that's where I'm so in tune with what I'm doing because those are really practice days for race. So I'm really being more thoughtful about making sure I'm fueling throughout. a workout that's a long run for me.
And for you, as you know, as you've navigated your professional running career, was there like an aha moment for you where you realized like, hey, this fueling thing is really important, or was it kind of natural for you as you moved up in distance where it was just coached and taught to you that like, hey, I have to figure out fueling and I have to pay attention to fueling for these workouts?
It's definitely been more of an aha as I've gotten older. I think, unfortunately, younger and dumber Dakota could kind of get away with less and maybe listen to my male counterpart teammates on like what they were doing, realizing that like what a woman does is different than what a man does, and realizing that women can't, for example, shouldn't be running without any fuel. Like my teammates would wake up and they just go for a run, not eat before. And now I have realized that's not as it's not as great for women specifically. So it's definitely been something that I've been learning and realizing like, oh, when I fuel well for my workouts and my long runs, I feel better. So it's it's been something I've been learning for sure.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear like even, you probably had a lot of success relatively speaking in your career even before you were really focused on that, right? But perhaps learning to fuel has helped you really elevate it and take it to a whole different level as you've been able to do. Greg, kind of in working with runners of different levels, people on closer to Dakotah's end of the spectrum versus, people doing their first race. Are there some common themes that you kind of hear from runners in terms of challenges when it comes to fueling for runs? Like why are we, why do we have this conversation every year? Like, why? It's because it's difficult, right? It's not easy to figure out. But what are the things that people are struggling with when it comes to fueling for these runs?
Bob kind of alluded to it. I think people want it to be formulaic. They all want it to be one size fits all, and you do this and this and this, and you have success. And we know we're all so different. It's the same as why the same training plan doesn't work for every runner. The same nutrition plan doesn't work. And so that creates a lot of over information, you might say, where people get confused. What am I supposed to do? And I feel like a big part of it is explaining you have to start trying. You have to start experimenting and learning what works for you, which may be very different than your training partner, but that's part of the process. And this process of learning what works for you, just like the process of learning what training works for you, it's all the same. And so sometimes that kind of relieves the pressure of, well, I'm trying the formula and it's not working for me. Why not? Because it works for my training partner. So I feel like for people that are beginning to think about their fueling, the first step is to understand you just have to start trying. And if you fail, if there's a problem or you bonk or you have an upset stomach, that's fine. That's information that we then use to modify going forward. And usually through a training cycle or two, you really narrow down what works for you. And then you can get into the refinement based on what event you're racing, what maybe the temperature is like, the conditions, where you are, how fit you feel like going into the race, and how close to your maximum you're going to be able to race. All of those things, that's like the refinement phase. But in the beginning, I feel like it's the experimentation phase. And for a lot of people, they just need to understand that that's part of the process, that it's not a formula. You need to kind of get started and experiment, and then you will learn what works for you. And boy, is there comfort once you get that dialed in, because then you don't have to worry about that on race weekend. You can focus on bringing your A game.
Absolutely. And yeah, you hear that time and time again, like people, even it's funny, even just interacting with runners around a big race, you can kind of tell the people who feel good about their plan and are comfortable and have things dialed in, right? Versus the people that are still a day away from the race trying to figure it out. Dakotah, for you, like what have been the things that have been, the toughest to figure out, or like what are the things that even as you've been able to have success and run fast times and good races, you've still felt like I wish this was working better, or I'm trying to tinker with this when it comes specifically to your fueling?
Yeah, a big lesson that I learned this last year. I mean, 2024 was like one of my best years as a human. I felt like you can't top that, but I also had one of my worst races at New York. And what I learned was that, I had this fueling strategy that I used for the Olympic trials and the Olympics, and they both went really great. So I mimicked that fueling strategy for New York. which was like 40 degrees on the starting line, where the Olympic trials and the Olympics were both 60 to 70 degrees. And I learned very quickly that you need more carbs when it's cold. So I think the biggest struggle that I've dealt with in my career is realizing that the temperature is like really important. And you have to be able to tinker and know, okay, well, if it's going to be colder, I'm going to need more carbs because I'm going to be burning more energy to stay warm. And I, bonked really hard at New York and even had like vision issues. I could hardly see by the end. And so I feel like that, I mean, that was really the last push that got me to be like, okay, I need to figure out something that is different, something that is better and will work for me instead of me trying to figure it out mid-race.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. And let's kind of get into it. Dakotah's brought up the idea of carbs and needing carbs. Bob, maybe kind of school us a little bit on the basics. Like, what is the role of carbohydrates for runners, and why do runners need carbs, and why do runners potentially need more carbs as they go longer in distance?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic because it's becoming so I believe it's becoming watered down, the whole carbohydrate conversation during training and during exercise and racing, because let's just look at the dichotomy here. Back in the days, right, we were recommending, we meaning research, was spitting out that we should consume 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour to supply our muscles with enough energy to locomote, to move forward, right? Now that is being challenged, by the way. So maybe perhaps we do this next year and I'll have some updated research to report on. But anyway, I digress. So that's 120 to 240 calories an hour. But now the research kind of looked, it's kind of been progressing, and now our upper window, it's not even a window, it's not even a ceiling anymore. It's like 90 grams an hour. So we've got this huge range between 30 and 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour, which actually I've seen upwards of 120 grams per hour, not in runners, mostly cyclists. But the point is this: we have this huge range of carbohydrate, I would say, recommendations per hour to consume during exercise. Carbohydrates are needed for energy. Yes, absolutely. They are needed more so at higher intensities. And I think that's where a lot of recreational runners start to digress a little bit, because to Greg's point earlier, everyone's kind of lumping themselves in the same box and saying, oh, well, Dakotah does this and I'm just doing my first marathon, I'm going to do the same thing she does. Right? It doesn't make sense, because we have to look at not only the length, but also the intensity. So we know that our bodies in a non-disease state, we utilize fat very well for energy up to a certain point of exercise intensity. Now you can change that. That's affectionately called the metabolic efficiency training concept, which I created, which Varn, but you can change that. But up to a certain point, your body is preserving carbohydrates until it isn't. And it's usually right around that zone 3 for most athletes. If they're well conditioned, maybe around the zone 4. So right above that is when the body calls for more carbohydrates. That's exactly what Dakotah was describing. She was just at that point, right? That's when the body needs more carbohydrate, and we don't want to neglect it by any means. I know where we're going with this, so I won't jump ahead with it, but that's kind of the long-winded story of why we need carbs, and more importantly, I think when we start to need more carbohydrates during exercise. Barb, we can't hear you.
Better that I shouldn't put myself on mute before I speak. First time on a video call, guys. So what can I say? So what you were starting to talk about, Bob, the carbohydrates, and kind of the role of carbohydrates. Like, there's maybe a certain kind of school of thought that thinks about carbohydrates as like, I need to replace what I'm burning to a certain degree, and I need a certain amount of carbohydrates on board in order to have the energy to keep going. There's also other schools of thought that talk more about blood sugar stabilization, right? And it's not the amount of carbs you need, but it's getting the optimal amount of carbohydrate, or the right type of carbohydrate that's gonna balance your blood sugar, and that's really what's going to impact your energy. Can you kind of just talk about like those two schools of thoughts and how they how do they go hand in hand, or are they different schools of thought in any way.
Trying to accomplish the same thing, and that is just feeding the body and the muscles and the brain carbohydrates, but they're coming at it from different angles, right? One on the on the simple sugar concept, it's more about maintaining very consistent levels of blood sugar specifically. So the frequency of feeding simple sugars is very high. You might see every 30 minutes, every 45 minutes, right? Because we know when you're using a lot of carbohydrates, you're burning a lot of carbohydrates, you need a lot more supplemental carbohydrates because you will eventually run out, of course, depending on the length and the intensity of what you're doing. Whereas on the flip side, if you have a slower burning energy, such, the Live Steady and the UCAN product, that will actually, non-scientific terms, burn slower. So now we're not needing to ingest it as often. So it might be more in terms of like 75 minutes instead of every 30 to 45 minutes. So it's just a different, they're both carbohydrates. This is what gets me is a lot of athletes, a lot of runners are shaming carbohydrates, and carbohydrates should not be shamed, because we need to remember that there are different types of carbohydrates which function differently, but also metabolize differently in the body. And that's what we're talking about. We're not playing, good guy, bad guy with carbs. We're just talking about the differences in metabolism and the function when we're consuming different types of carbs. So non-simple sugar-based, i.e. UCAN, versus simple sugar-based.
Yep. That's a great clarifying point. Greg, as a coach in your role, you often hear runners might say, oh, my coach told me I need 60 grams, or my coach told me I should shoot for 90. Like how much are you getting these types of questions, people looking at it from how many grams of carb do I need to consume per hour? And how do you answer that question as a coach, perhaps in a more nuanced way than just this is the number?
Well, and maybe I approach it differently because I feel like it is experiential. And so it's more like, well, let's start somewhere and see how you feel. So my bottom line is your gut happy throughout the run? And is your brain happy throughout the run? And do you feel powerful? And that the closer you get to mimicking your race, so as you do sort of goal-paced training and dress rehearsals, the more you can mimic that and the better all three of those things are, then you dial it in. And so I feel like trying to move away from I have to force X amount of grams per hour or whatever. And it's more, well, how did you feel? How was your performance in that particular run or workout? And that begins to be the guide. And I typically like to start with the least complicated process first, because Dakotah and I were talking earlier, you go into a race, you don't want to be thinking about too much. You really want to be on automatic pilot. So the simplest strategy usually works. Go out, do a run, fuel minimally, and see how you feel. And then you can add on to that. As long as your gut stays happy, your brain stays happy, and you feel powerful toward the end, you are really narrowing in what works for you. And again, I really pull back from it being so formulaic. You can do that, and a lot of people do, and it's a very easy way to get started, but be open that it may not be that many grams per hour for you. You may be able to get away with less. You may need more. You may need it differently throughout the event. There's a lot of factors that go into it, and just be open to experimenting. But I think those three, at least for me as a coach, I'm asking, how was your gut? Did you have any upset stomach? Did you have to take a potty break? Were you happy? Were you motivated? Were you excited? Or were you more, well, I just want this run to be over? And did you feel powerful? Were you not slowing down? Did you feel like you could speed up toward the end? Then you're really dialing in exactly what works for you. And then you can reverse engineer how many grams or how often you take something. You can do it that way. I like that, because then people don't feel like they're getting it wrong or they're going against some recommendation. They're going, this is what works for me. It's no different than picking out your shoes, right? Not every racing shoe is going to work for every runner. You have to experiment and say, well, this works for me. That's kind of the approach I like. I think it takes a lot of pressure off the runner of forcing something, and it does allow you to get in tune with your body and what works for you.
Yeah, and this is the beauty of having three people on that come at this from different perspectives. It's fascinating to hear kind of all of your guys takes and spins on a similar question. So Dakotah, for you, How analytical are you when it comes to counting grams of carbs? Have you over your career been coached at all that you need a certain amount? How do you kind of go about figuring out this process for yourself?
Yeah, I feel like I have a similar like-minded coach to Greg where it's what works for you. It's not, hey, hit X amount of grams per hour or put X amount in every bottle. It's been more, let's figure out what makes you feel good when you're running. And I was never super scientific with it. I just kind of did what was working in training and would just mimic that in races. But the issue with that is that, there are different factors in races, the temperature being one. So I'm like Greg and I were talking about before the call started, like I just wanted it to be simple. So that's where I decided like UCAN would be a really great product for me is because I don't have to make it very complicated. There is no math. There is no me, trying to figure out how many scoops of this, and I have to drink all of my bottle in order to get all of the carbs. I feel like with the slower burn that I can just kind of go by feel a little bit more. And in my, in being an elite runner, sometimes I miss bottles. And before, if I missed a bottle, I was in full panic mode, thinking like, well, that's all those carbs that I didn't get. Where now I feel so much more comfortable just going into the race and saying, okay, I know that I'm going to have energy from start to finish as long as I fuel, throughout. It doesn't have to be, I don't have to be worried about like the spike and the crash from sugars.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective to hear, and kind of one that we do hear echoed from elite runners, where it is a lot less of a precise game when you have that even flow. Actually, we hear this from anybody when you have that even flow of energy. It's you don't have to be as precise or as spot on with every single dose of it. And we're definitely, I know there's a lot of people on this call already seeing questions coming in about UCAN. We've got a lot of people on this call who have used UCAN. Obviously, we've got a lot of people on this call who may have never used UCAN before. We're gonna dive in a little bit further here in a little bit on kind of the specific difference between UCAN. But Bob, before we do that, maybe you could kind of you started to do this a little bit, but maybe you could school us a little bit on like where did this idea of the 60 to 90 grams of carbs per hour, and now it's being pushed up to even as much as 120. There's somebody in the chat that asked that specific question with this massive push in just 90 to 120 grams of carbs per hour. Where does it come from? How does the approach differ with UCAN? Let's start with the first part of the question. Like, where did it come from? And what these recommendations in terms of how many carbs you need per hour, they're based on simple sugars, right? They're not kind of universally based on any type of carbohydrate. So can you kind of just talk us through that and how these recommendations came to be?
Yeah, and I'm gonna forget the year. I have no idea the year. It was a while ago, but I vividly remember this because this is when Power Bar came out with their C2 Max. I'm totally dating myself here, but it was a while ago, right? And this was from research from Dr. Asker Ukendrup, and who was looking at two different simple sugars. So we have actually two transport mechanisms on the small intestine, one for glucose and one for fructose. So in his research, he was actually testing, hey, instead of only feeding like glucose, which was traditionally like 15, 20, 25 years ago, that was traditionally what we were seeing in a lot of product, glucose and maltodextrin, right? So then he pushed the envelope, took it to the next level and said, well, what if because he knew, because he's a physiologist, great physiologist, said, well, if we have this fructose transporter, what if we feed fructose with glucose? This is where the whole thing blew up in terms of feeding more than 60 grams an hour, because that was the ceiling. Once his research proved that we can actually absorb, so the body can absorb more carbohydrates if fed two different simple sugars, that being glucose and fructose, then it just unleashed the beast, essentially, right? So then it was more the race to see, well, now what's the new ceiling? So they set it at 90 because I feel like that's the safe ceiling. There's been research up to 144 grams of carbohydrate per hour. I mean, seriously, as an athlete myself, endurance athlete who has been plagued with GI distress, I can't even imagine. I mean, I've tried different products at higher levels, and I literally had GI distress like that, right? But anyway, I go back to this, what I was saying. So that's kind of, it was based on research. So we're we're kind of in a flux right now because we've got on one side this 30 to 60 gram per hour of carbohydrate, right? That is safe. We know that up to 60 grams per hour, you can feed a glucose or a maltodextrin only. We're talking about simple sugars, right? Once you pass 60 grams, so 61 grams and over, the body actually cannot absorb a single sugar anymore. It needs a different type of sugar, i.e. fructose. That's where it comes into the story. So if you need more than 61 grams of carbohydrate per hour, it needs to be a dual transporter. So it needs to be a dual sugar, hence the whole glucose or maltodextrin with a fructose, right? That's where this other part of science is going right now. Although I will tell you anecdotally, I have not had the best success with that with a lot of the athletes I've worked with, both, from runners and triathletes and cyclists and open water swimmers, only because of GI distress, right? The more you feed the stomach, unless you train the gut, which is another whole different topic, if your body is trained, if your gut is trained to assimilate that many grams of carbohydrate, you might be able to pull it off without GI distress. It's a very few and far between. But back to the whole UCAN story with the Live Steady starch, it's not a simple sugar, right? So now we don't have that issue of these dual transport mechanisms. So, I mean, and you know this too, Varn. I mean, I've got athletes using 2-3 edges, which is the UCAN gel, per hour with no issues at all, no digestive issues, great energy, great everything, right? And the reason why they dose higher is because, like I said earlier, they just run hotter, right? Their thermostats are hotter. I mean, I'm one of those running hotter athletes. Like I know exactly from metabolic efficiency testing, I know how many calories my body burns like in a zone 2 run, and it's high. It is abnormally high for my height and weight and all that stuff. I'm one of those who needs a minimum of 2 UCAN edges per hour just because of my physiology.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, like, what factors kind of determine whether you would need less or more?
Yeah, it's really your burn rate, to be honest with you. And Dakotah hinted also too, like in the cold, your body needs more calories normally to sustain itself. And I say normally because I've actually worked with a couple of climbers who've climbed Everest, and they are not runners, right? But obviously it's cold in Everest, and we've actually trained them to be more fat adapted, so they didn't have to carry a lot of food with them. But again, they are not running; they are just like hiking at extreme altitudes. But we look at the cold environments, we look at your burn rates, which is a lot to be determined from your physiology, to be honest with you. So look at in your genetics, look at mom, dad, grandma, and grandpa, which you can have measured. It's so easy to have that measured; it's not even funny. And then looking at maybe even different courses. And that'd be a really interesting question I have for Dakotah, like if it's a flat course versus a hilly course, right? Because again, hillier courses, your energy expenditure or calorie expenditure goes up. So that may require your body to consume more carbohydrates.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so a lot of different factors that impact it. Bob, I'm going to come back to you in a moment. Greg, when we're talking about the simple sugar fueling strategy, where does it fall short for runners that you've worked with? Obviously, it works for some runners. For the runners it doesn't work for, what are the reasons it doesn't work? What are they expressing to you?
Well, Dakotah and Bob mentioned both of them. Bob mentioned the GI distress, and I think that's a big one for a lot of people. That gel that may have tasted delicious at mile 5 makes you want to vomit at mile 20 because your stomach just cannot tolerate anymore. It doesn't want it. It's dehydrated. It doesn't absorb as well. There's all these factors, and I think a lot of us, certainly that came through the first wave of fueling. We did a lot of bonking and GI distress and porta potty stops we didn't want. So I think that's the big one of people that have GI distress. Your gut has to stay happy. If it's not happy, you're not focused on performance. You're focused on something else. And the second is the spike in the crash, the timing issue. Dakotah made a great point. She doesn't have to freak out if she misses a bottle, that she's going to miss the timing so that she's going to crash before she gets a chance to get to her next bottle. When you have this sort of steady energy, you don't have to worry about the timing as much. And that's a big problem particularly for those of us who are regular runners. We don't get our own bottles put out at races, right? We're dealing with traffic jams at all of the aid stations. And so that challenge of making sure that you don't have your blood glucose drop. And we all know if your blood glucose goes low, you're not in a optimal performance state. So those two things, I think, are why a lot of people enjoy looking at alternative strategies to the just dump in as much simple sugar as you can. They're looking for something that's a little more stable, a little less challenging to the GI system, and something that doesn't have maybe as complicated or at least as regimented of a fueling strategy when you go into a race environment, which doesn't always go exactly as we plan. So I feel like for my runners, a lot of times that's what I'm hearing. And I'm like, okay, here, let's try this. This might be a better strategy for you if you're having either of those particular issues.
Great insight, Greg. Dakotah, to kind of build on what Greg was talking about. So for you talked about specifically kind of what you encountered in New York, with, maybe feeling like because of the weather you needed to get in more, and it was difficult for you to do that. What other kind of in your time, using a primarily simple sugar-based fueling strategy, like we talked about, had many great races doing it. So there were certain times it clearly worked really well for you. When it didn't work, or maybe even when it worked well, what were like some of the tricky things for you to navigate relying on like solely a simple sugar-based fueling strategy?
Yeah, you heard me talk about this in New York, but during races, almost every race I've done, I would have that stomach upset and would, ultimately feel like I was going to throw up, most of the time end up throwing up, and it's disgusting, but I would try my best to keep what I could in my mouth because I felt like so desperately that I needed those calories and those carbs. So I was constantly having stomach issues mid-race, and something that, isn't race revolved around racing necessarily, but in training when I would use sugary products during like my long runs, I would finish and just feel like so icky from all of the sugar that I had just inhaled. So I would have a really hard time fueling after runs, which is so scary. Like you need to be getting in so much protein right after and more carbs to make sure that you're recovering well and getting the benefits from your long runs and your workouts. And I was so far from being able to do that. I would take like little sips of protein, but I was getting nowhere near the recommended amount because my stomach was just so upset from those runs.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Like, so we always think about the impact of fueling on kind of like I take something in and how do I feel in the moments after I take it in. But what you're really talking about is like, how does a certain fueling strategy impact the way I feel, hours after I run and the way I recover? Like, there's so many sort of tangential byproducts to what you choose and how you choose to fuel during your run. Bob, just coming back to you to kind of round this out. So where we started here, this idea of like more is better, and figuring out like how can I cram more simple sugars into my system, and how much can I actually tolerate. Like ultimately these studies and these research, these were studies on high-end performance, right? So even if you accept some of the conclusions here and say this is what you need, it's not what everybody needs, right? They're really looking at what people trying to perform to the highest world class end potentially would need. Can you maybe just elaborate on that, and then kind of as a secondary point to that, for the regular person who's running to be healthy, who's running to be fit, who's running for longevity, like what are sort of the metabolic detriments to a high sugar fueling strategy?
So glad you brought that up because I was biting my tongue when Dakotah was talking. I'm like, oh, I so want to talk about that. Anyway, yeah, to your point, like the earlier research on this whole, not like this really overfeeding carbohydrate, let's call it, like the 60 grams, 61 grams and above. Earlier research was done on young males, highly competitive, like seriously high VO2 maxes, professional athletes kind of thing. The research is getting a little better these days. Like we're starting to see it include females, more recreational based. But that's the thing, right? I mean, we are so different as human beings. in terms of gender, but also within gender, right? So we need to actually look at our fitness. And that's why I always, like in my flow charts, very close to what Greg was saying too, like when an athlete says, well, what should I fuel during with, or, what should I have? And I say, well, question one on my flow chart is, do you or have you had GI distress, right? The next question is, what level of competitiveness are you? Because that's what I was kind of alluding to earlier. The more recreational you are, you need to pay attention to not overfeeding your body with carbohydrates, because it is very likely that you will have some type of GI distress. And can I just define that really quick? Because a lot of athletes just think GI distress is using the porta potty. No, it's nausea, maybe not even vomiting. It's bloating, it's GERD, it's gas, right? It doesn't have to be those frequent or emergency pit stops in the porta potties. So when there is something like that happening downstairs during a run, during a race, that's not normal. Like I was told that was normal when I was trying to figure it out, 20, 30 years ago, which led me on this whole journey. It's not normal to have that. So that's why we see that separation with the research. I kind of feel like the research that is promoting that up to 90 grams per hour of carbohydrate per hour is really looking at those elite male athletes. And then everything else is kind of funneling down to us recreational people, right? Now, are there outside the bell-shaped curve are outliers? Absolutely, but that's physiology, right? Okay, so that's that question. The second one, which I was really aiming to get a little word in, is metabolic health, right? And I remember having this conversation probably 20 years ago with a high-level triathlete, an Olympic level triathlete. And he was an Ironman at that time. And he was like, no, I'm going to have 3 or 4 gels an hour on the bike. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm doing the math. And my first question to him was like, but what is that going to do to your pancreas? What is that going to do to your metabolic health? So here's the argument to that. Oh, when I'm exercising, everything is okay because I'll burn those calories. That's true. You are going to burn the calories, right? But even though insulin is fairly suppressed during exercise, your pancreas, which secretes insulin, sorry for the science lesson, is going to take a little bit of a hit, but not a big hit. But here's what it does. The more simple sugars you eat, I love that Dakotah brought that up. It is going to curb your appetite post-training. So now you can't get the nutrients in to recover your body. But what that also does psychologically is it trains your brain to like sweet foods, i.e. cravings. Cravings usually happen because blood sugar is bottoming. The whole goal of this is not to have blood sugar high or low, right? We want to stay right in between to have steady energy. So the more simple sugars you eat during exercise or during training, the more you are teaching your brain, that happy center in your brain, to want sweet foods. Thus, after your run, you will try to seek out high added sugar sweet foods. And that is horrible for anyone's health, not even talking about longevity.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's so fascinating, like that whole after effect of fueling with sugars, right? It's really something that I think I'm so happy that you and Dakotah both highlighted that point, because I think, yeah, the more you're putting in terms of empty, I mean, I don't know if empty calories, whether that's the right way to characterize it or not, but yeah, it's a lot tougher to put in actual nutrient dense food into your system right when you need it. So this has been great. A lot of great background information. I want to take the last 10 or 15 minutes we have in this session to talk kind of a little bit more specifically about UCAN, and kind of, now knowing all of this, how do you guys think about UCAN, and how do you kind of utilize UCAN in your routine? So I'll just give the quick background for folks who may not know, and we've alluded to this a few times, but UCAN, primarily the products for runners come in gel and powder form, and they're really based on the same ingredient, which is a unique starch. It's a non-GMO complex starch that breaks down and burns very slowly. So whereas most gels, like Bob talked about, are they're going to use simple sugar, glucose, sucrose, fructose, or even slightly more complex carbohydrate in maltodextrin. These are all designed to give you quick energy, and they act like sugars. They're designed to give you that very quick burst. And that's, as we've discussed over the last several minutes, that's what a lot of the carbohydrate dosing and recommendations are based around. But this UCAN starch was actually developed initially for a very unique reason. One of our co-founders' sons, Jonah, he had a very rare blood sugar disease, where basically he needed to be fed every 2 hours continuously, day and night, to maintain a stable glucose level, to maintain stable blood sugar. And we developed a cooking technology, a patented cooking technology that when you apply it to starch, causes it to break down a lot more slowly and steadily over time. So initially back in 2009, when this was first discovered, these kids with this condition called glycogen storage disease, they were taking the starch prior to sleeping at night, about 90 to 120 grams of the starch, and it was keeping their blood sugar stable at rest, granted, for 8 to 10 hours. So they were actually able to sleep through the night. It was a truly a life-saving discovery. And then, starting around 2010, Bob, you were one of the first people we got the product into the hands of, just to understand, is this any different than what's out there? Greg, you were testing it back in 2011 when you ran the Boston Marathon, again, trying to figure out, like, is this any different from what I'm kind of currently doing, or does this work differently? And I think certainly the science has shown that the way the UCAN starch is metabolized relative to simple sugars during exercise, it's a lot more sustained and stable. But then outside of that, I think the athlete experiences and the real world experiences have also taught us the same thing. So, for I've seen many comments in here talking about your experiences with gels, or I've struggled with gels. I don't know what to take, and I just do want to tell you that, like, while UCAN is a gel, it's sort of, when you compare it to the whole array of sugar-based gels, it's kind of a gel in name only. It's a very different taste experience, texture experience, and metabolically, in terms of the way it makes you feel, it's also very different. So maybe, Dakotah, kind of from that standpoint, let's just start with you, kind of more subjectively, maybe not as scientific, like in terms of how UCAN makes you feel, and when you fuel with UCAN during these workouts. First of all, how are you using it? What product specifically might you use to fuel a certain type of workout? Maybe you could take us through that, and then maybe just talk about how you feel doing that workout, both during and after, with UCAN versus how you might have felt before when you were trying to do it all with simple sugars.
Yeah, I mean, I lean on the edge mostly just for convenience factor, because it's already mixed. It's, I can take it quick, run out the door. And I'm using usually an edge before most workouts or long runs, and sometimes even like a double if I'm feeling maybe a little under my calories and just feeling like I need some energy to get out the door. I'll take one of those. But I am using the mix on, long runs in a bottle when I have access to somebody who will hold a bottle for me or bike with me when my husband is feeling generous. And that's what I plan to do with the Boston Marathon. And I think something that, if you've not ever used UCAN, the Edge specifically, it's not like a gel specifically in the texture. I think that's something that's so important for people to try, because it's not like honey. It's more like a smoothie. It's got a much better consistency, in my opinion. Like, it doesn't feel like it like clogs your throat the way that a lot of like sugary products would. So I feel like in that aspect, I'm like looking forward to it during my long runs and my workouts. And it just overall just makes me feel very consistent, which is exactly what I want. Like, I don't think about like, oh, I'm not really feeling in the mood for this next bottle or gel that's coming up. I'm like looking forward to it. Specifically, like the flavors for me that I really like are the pineapple and the vanilla latte, which is a caffeinated flavor. And I love to use caffeine in my races and workouts. So that's what I really lean on.
Awesome. And yeah, that's really one other thing I was going to ask you, as you're getting ready for the Boston Marathon coming up here. Have you thought about kind of the frequency in a race situation of how often you want to take UCAN? Does it differ in any way? Like, are you thinking you might want to try to get in more in racing than you do in training? Like, how do you kind of, how are you navigating that?
Well, what I love is that I'm not at all anxious about it, because I know that I don't have to be scientific with it. So I will absolutely at every station have a bottle and an edge waiting for me. But, I can go more based off feel. I always in general like to do like a gel or a bottle right at the starting line. So I'll use an Edge, probably the vanilla latte to get my caffeine, and then I will have one available it's roughly every 5K at Boston.
There you go. You got a inside look at the fueling strategy for Dakotah. Appreciate that, Dakotah. Thanks for sharing that. Greg, when you think about UCAN and how you kind of recommend athletes you work with using it, so two questions for you. One is what, we're going back now. Like I said, 2011 perhaps was the first time you used it, but if you can remember to back then, why did you want to use it at that time? Like, what made you feel like, hey, this is something I want to give it a try? And now, obviously, as you've coached many, many athletes through using it, how do you, at a starting point, recommend athletes fuel with UCAN?
Well, I guess to Bob's point, I was studying exercise science, so I was following the guidelines and what you're supposed to do. And I really suffered from the spike and crash. I don't know what it is, but my body is very sensitive to the spike and crash. So in my marathons, I just continued to I'm great through, halfway. And then all of a sudden, I really struggled to avoid the crash and feeling bad just when I wanted to feel good. So that was sort of the impetus of like, well, there's got to be something that I'm missing here. And that's why I was glad that I found UCAN, because I feel like it's like you want this base of energy. Dakotah kind of mentioned it. It's a base. You've got to, and you can augment on top of that, but you don't want to go below the base. That's where poor performance happens. And so I feel like that is the story of UCAN, is this base of energy that's consistent and steady, and you can augment it and play around based on your particular flavor profile or what you like, and that can be very helpful. So for runners who are like, you have to tell me, give me a strategy to start, I say, fine. Here, 15 minutes to 30 minutes before you start your long run, take an edge. Whatever flavor you like, it doesn't matter, take it. And then take one every around 45 minutes, take another edge in your long runs and see how you feel. That is like the base strategy, you might say. And then you learn, maybe I need more, or maybe I need less, or I need them more frequently or less frequently, or maybe in the start I need it less frequently and then later I need more, or maybe I want to augment it with something else, that the caffeine toward the end. It's really individual, but for me, if they really press me like, you have to give me a strategy, I say 15 to 30 minutes before, take an edge every around 45 minutes, see how you feel. If you feel you need more, just add more. The nice thing is you could take 2 or 3 gels, edges consecutively, and you won't have any GI distress. So you're not at risk like you would be if you're like, I want to add another gel. But to Dakotah's point, I can't imagine putting another syrupy, thick thing into me when I'm trying to run, and how much water do I have to wash it down with to get it to be palatable. You can experiment with edge from that standpoint. So that's kind of this is our starting point, and then we can kind of figure it out from there.
Excellent. Excellent. That's very, very simple and easy to follow. And one of the things you were talking about, like, I think that's what's so unique about UCAN, right? Is it like it fits into both the less is more strategy and the more is more strategy, in the sense that if like people are struggling um with not getting enough fuel because they can't stomach it, like you just talked about, this is something where you could take 2 or 3 gels per hour and it's going to be a lot easier on your gut. But at the same time, if you're also like, hey, for a lot of people, they're like, hey, I don't need nearly as much of this as I do of the sugar-based fuels, because it's coming in more evenly and keeping my blood sugar stable. Bob, kind of for you, a similar question, but I'll frame it slightly differently. One is, I know that we do have some ultra marathoners in here, so and you're doing a long 200-mile run coming up yourself. So
Don't over exaggerate, but yeah, well,
how much is it?
145.
145? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not going to put those extra. 104. I was like, I'll round up by 55 miles. No big deal. But okay, I'll keep you at 145. I think I only sent you enough UCAN for 145 miles, not for 200. So,
Yeah.
but yeah. So we have some ultra marathoners in here. Like for you doing that, long distance run. How do you think about how much you're going to be consuming per hour, and then how do you also think about supplementing? With things other than UCAN. So whether it's things you need because you're going really long? Or again, if like, are there athletes that can have success using UCAN and simple sugars in conjunction? And if so, how would you recommend the two be used together?
Yeah, I think I'll go real quick on my personal because everyone is so different, which we've been alluding to. But remember with ultra running, it's very different than marathoning. I mean, we're out there for a long time, right? But another thing we need to remember is the non-elites, us normal people, it's ultra marathon running is very lower intensity compared to like a marathon, right? So usually in that situation, we have more blood flow to our guts, which means we can usually consume a little bit different than if we're going to have a little bit higher intensity. So that's the beauty of ultra running is that lower pace, usually lower intensity, lower heart rate means more blood to the gut, which means we can process we can process calories more successfully, even if you've had GI distress before, such as myself, right? So that's my first limiter is like, ooh, right? I don't want to push the envelope too much. With me, like it's very simple. I actually kind of flip-flop back and forth between edge, between the hydrate, which we haven't talked about. That's the UCAN hydrate or the electrolyte powder. And then I use, I make my own energy bites, which is just foods like some nuts and some dried fruit and stuff. I find that for my gut, that's the ideal scenario. And only because sometimes I do want to have a different palate feel, right? So if you imagine being out there for 2 days versus 2 hours and change, which Dakotah's doing, right? There's a big difference there, right? I usually don't want to consume the same thing every single hour because that's just you get flavor fatigue and you just get fatigue from eating or sipping the same thing. So I try to offset it. I try personally in my early days in ultra running, I tried to have like an A, B, and C strategy just in case the gut got weird. Now I just have an A strategy, but I minimize the products that I use because I know what works in training. I've tested it, tried and true, and I don't want to deviate from that at all. Like, and you remember, Varn, that one year I did solo, I did rim to rim to rim. Remember that? And I said, hey, Varn, I did it all on UCAN products because I just wanted to try it. And if something happened, something happened. I mean, maybe I would have been stuck in the Grand Canyon. Who knows? But I want, like, that's my mindset is like make it as simple as possible, right? Like let's not. So when I hear ultra runners, they're like, oh, in this hour, and then the next day I'm going to do a whole sort of different menu. I'm like, man, you're just risking some problems downstairs in the digestive system. So I would kind of stress more towards the simple is sustainable. And that's why maybe only choosing a couple products, maybe one food product also, if like real food, if you're going to have, I don't know, whatever it is. But don't deviate too much from that. Don't introduce too much that the gut has to process differently, even though it's lower intensity. And that's the key, I think. And another thing we haven't even talked about with ultra running is the weight, right? You get so much more bang for your buck when, let me not say you. I get so much bang for my buck when I have to carry a product like the Edge that I'm taking every 60 to 75 minutes, right? You look at the weight of that versus 2 or 3 other gels that I probably have to take to have the same about equal energy stability. And now there's a weight consequence, right? So ultra runners, we don't like carrying a lot, right? It just doesn't make sense. So we want to be as light as possible and as efficient as possible because we don't have, I mean, yes, we have aid stations, but they may be 15 to 25 miles apart, right? So we don't have that luxury sometimes.
Absolutely. And kind of what one other element that I talked about, may and anybody, Greg, if you want to chime in on this too, because I know you've put out some materials about this, but when we're talking about kind of pairing UCAN with simple sugars, and maybe Greg, I'll start with you and then come back to Bob. Like, how have you seen athletes have success with kind of a mixed approach?
Dakotah kind of mentioned it too. Sometimes you want a boost of energy, and that's the difference with UCAN. You're not going to get this sort of elated, I took it and I feel amazing for 5 or 10 minutes, right? You don't get that. But maybe later in the race, you do want more of that, and it's less risky because you only have 15 minutes or 30 minutes or 45 minutes left in the race, so you're willing to risk the spike and crash more then. So sometimes people use kind of a hybrid strategy where UCAN forms the base of their fueling from right before and through the bulk of the race. And maybe toward the end, they want to add some gasoline to the fire where they're using a simple sugar or something that's going to give them more of that real quick burst of mental energy. Again, I think it works well in the last 30 to 45 minutes. I think if you get farther out from that, like an hour, hour and a half, you're kind of risking some GI distress and the crash, the spike and crash. So a lot of times athletes, if they say, I like it, I felt okay, but I didn't get that sort of really big boost of mental energy, I say, that's fine. Top it off with a more fast acting carbohydrate, caffeine as well, right at the end, and really get that little boost you might need when you are kind of feeling the, wow, I've been doing this a long time and I'm tired and I really wish the finish line would appear before me sooner. Maybe that's a strategy that you can use. And again, you can try it in training and see if it works. And then once you've got it dialed in, you're on automatic pilot through the race. I think it minimizes the GI risk. It minimizes the spike and crash risk. It still keeps the fueling strategy pretty simple. And so those things are usually what you want as an athlete going into a race, like Dakotah's going to do a month from now when she lines up in Hopkinton.
Absolutely. And Greg, you brought up one of the things we haven't talked a whole lot about, just in terms of caffeine. So one of the newer products that we just recently launched was the UCAN gels with caffeine. So it's been interesting, right? Because the whole, kind of history of us talking about UCAN, it has been exactly what you said, where you don't feel that immediate boost. Now, this is sort of like the first UCAN product where 75 milligrams of caffeine, it's as much as a cup of coffee. You will feel it right away in terms of that mental clarity, but you still have the same live steady, sustain release carbohydrate. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds in that sense. Bob, in terms of just like the role of caffeine and what Greg was just talking about, giving you that boost later in the race, which, historically people might turn to sugar-based fuel. Like, what is the role of caffeine and for a runner to take caffeine mid-race, like, will that provide a similar boost to what sugar might provide, especially if
Yeah.
they're taking caffeine alongside carbohydrate like they would be with the UCAN gel?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, as long as they're fed still, right? You just can't take caffeine and expect it to work wonders, although it'll kind of work a little bit short, small wonders. But no, that's the thing. Like caffeine is a central nervous system stimulant, right? So it makes you feel better. And research has actually proven that it reduces your rating of perceived exertion. So we all know if you've been there, done that with caffeine mid-race, later in the race, you're like, wow, that's it's amazing in whatever form you're getting it in. It makes total sense. And I'm not going to pair like a simple sugar against like a UCAN, like the Live Steady starch. I don't want to play that game, but I want to say that they can, while these things can coexist, the fact that you guys added caffeine to the edge is a game changer, because what I'm seeing is now the discussions that I'm having with athletes now is, oh, well, maybe I don't need to augment with a simple sugar anymore to give me that boost, because now I have caffeine in the edge, which has that sustained energy, live steady starch in it. So that's been kind of changing my landscape personally as a sport dietitian, speaking to endurance athletes. So that's a blessing in disguise right there. But again, we know caffeine works, absolutely. However, let's just play the GI distress card one more time, because we haven't played it enough. If you are an athlete with GI distress, one, you need to get that fixed, right? Seriously, like call me up, email me, whatever. That's not normal. But caffeine can exacerbate your GI distress symptoms at some times, especially if you overconsume. So just be careful with it. I think we've been alluding to it the whole time, but please try this in training first, at least 3 to 4 months before your race, because you want to try these strategies out. You don't want to just, unfortunately I still have athletes doing this, Varn, and Greg, you'll appreciate this too. Like the week before the race, they're like, hey, I'm at the race expo. I'm going to pick up some UCAN and try it on the race on Saturday. And you're like, oh no, oh no, no. You haven't been using it. It's like, it's the same thing with a simple sugar product too, right? Like you want 3 to 4 months of experimenting to kind of really fine tune your approach to it. But in all, caffeine is a wonderful substance if used at the right time, the right place, and the right amounts.
Dakotah, for you as being a caffeine user and a caffeinated gel user, like, have you noticed a difference in how you feel when you pair the UCAN caffeinated gel, which has the Live Steady, the starch-based carb, compared to a sugar-based caffeinated gel where you're getting like the caffeine and sugar together? Is there anything you can kind of speak to between the difference between the two that you've noticed?
Yeah, I would think it's very difficult to find other type of gel that has that much caffeine to start. Like I was using a sugar-based drink in previous to working with UCAN, and I was putting a caffeine pill in some of my bottles because like they were, I would say, lacking in caffeine. So I really appreciate that you've packed so much caffeine into one little punch there so that I'm not having to supplement that way. And it's, you get that immediate, like, that feeling of like, oh, I'm awake and I'm back and I feel good. And we know that caffeine is a performance enhancing drug and it's legal. So I don't, as long as your stomach can handle it, I feel like it's so important to add to your regimen.
Excellent. Thank you guys for that insight. We did have a few people specifically asking about the caffeinated gels. We're going to wrap up here in just a minute or two. Really, really appreciate everybody who's stuck along with us for so long. A lot of terrific questions. You guys were spot on in your comments. Most of the questions actually just got answered in the natural flow of discussion, so people appreciated that. I'll just roll through a couple very quickly and answer them. We had a few questions about the difference between the UCAN powder and the UCAN gel. So they both have the same carbohydrate, the same live steady carbohydrate. They both work the same way. It's really just a matter of preference. Do you want the fluid or do you want or the powdered drink mix or do you want the gel? The drink does have slightly more calories and carbohydrates. It's 20 or 21 gram serving of carbohydrate versus about 15 to 17 grams of carbohydrates in the gel. So a little bit more calories in the drink. But I would say generally speaking, a lot of people like to use the drink as a preload, and then they'll have the gels during the run. And we've had a lot of athletes actually find that they can preload with one or two or even three servings of the drink, and it really gives them a good sustained base for the first 90 plus minutes of the marathon. Or if you're running a half marathon, you might take two or three servings of this before and maybe just need one gel during, if any. So very much interchangeable based on preference. We heard Dakotah talk about how she's going to have both the gel and the drink mixed up during the race. So we definitely have people that rotate between the two. We had another question about whether you need to chase the UCAN gel with water. That's a really, really unique element of the UCAN gel, at least the ones without caffeine. Maybe, and Bob, maybe you could comment on whether you should take water with the caffeinated gel. But without the gels without caffeine, they're very liquidy in consistency. I don't know if you can tell, but very, like Dakotah said, more like a smoothie type of consistency. So from a mouthfeel standpoint, you'll find them very drinkable. And then from a science standpoint, the way the starch digests, it doesn't require a certain volume of fluid to aid digestion like a simple sugar. So, you turn around a simple sugar-based gel and they'll actually tell you to consume it with a certain amount of fluid because that's what's needed to help those simple sugars digest. We don't have that same issue with the starch. So really any fluid you consume is really more based on personal preference or mouthfeel or thirst. I do want to add, this is not a replacement for hydration. This is not going to hydrate you on its own. It doesn't have a high electrolyte content in it. So you certainly need to consider hydration separate from this. But from a digestion standpoint, you don't need to drink water in order for this to digest. Bob, anything you want to add or just any nuance in terms of the caffeinated product in water?
I think it's pretty spot on. I have noticed that the new gels, the chocolate, the mocha, specifically, they're just a slight bit thicker. So you don't need anything to chase it down, but it's definitely a different mouthfeel than the fruitier ones or the unflavored ones. So I think just keeping that in mind.
Excellent. Well, with that, I think we hit all of our questions. I'll just go around in a quick circle and give each of you guys the last word. Greg, we'll start with you since I kept ending with you. Anything else you wanted to add to this discussion? Any kind of closing thoughts about either UCAN or fueling in general that you wanted to highlight?
Well, just back to the point that it's not a known fact. So you need to experiment. You have to try a lot of different things, and everybody's going to be different. And that's why if you ask 100 marathoners how they fuel, you're probably going to get 100 different strategies. So just being open to experimentation and always falling back to how does it affect my performance? How do I feel during and after? That is ultimately the most important metric of anything we're looking at, is how does it help you perform? Experiment, experiment, experiment until you get it dialed in, and then race day, you can focus on performing your best and not worrying about, did I get enough in or not?
Excellent, excellent tips from Greg. Thank you so much. Bob, we'll go to you next. Any closing thoughts from you? And I guess we should end this where it started, which is the simple question of like, how many carbs do I really need per hour? So maybe you can answer that, but then anything else you wanna add?
Well, I love that question, and Greg, you'll appreciate this because I ask athletes all the time. I'm like, ask me how many carbs you need per hour, and they ask me, I'm like, I don't know, right? Like we've got here's the thing, we've got research, and much like Greg, I like to start on the low end, although because of the whole experimentation process. So listen, if you're going to back me in a corner, twist my arm, I'm going to say start at about maybe 20 to 30 grams an hour. Like because again, you can always go up, but I'm so sensitive to GI distress. I always want to start low and then very slowly go up just in case any of the GI distress monster kind of rears its ugly head. But in terms of that, like I've got a lot of mantras, and one of them is just simple is sustainable. Let's keep it as simple as possible with the experimentation process, which is why I always kind of back up 3 to 4 months before your race. You should be starting to experiment with your sport nutrition.
Excellent, excellent. Good. I thank you for answering that question specifically. Now I can at least say, well, Bob said this, so now I've got an answer. But yeah, I think that's great. Like I mean, the point that you made is so spot on, right? There's no because you start at 20 or 30 doesn't mean you have to stay there. So if you can make it work, in a way that's more sustainable, that doesn't is simpler, then that all the more reason to try that. And Dakotah, last but certainly not least, really appreciate all the insights that you've added. Super interesting to hear about kind of your journey and experimentation. So thanks for being so transparent with that. I know a lot of people in the audience really appreciated it. But yeah, anything you want to add for runners in general as they're thinking about fueling or kind of navigating this journey? Any closing tips or thoughts?
Yeah, just that like fueling mid-run and mid-race doesn't have to be a burden. It can be something that you look forward to. And I think that's something that I've learned literally over the last 4 months of my very long career. It doesn't have to be something that you're dreading. So just kind of like Greg said, being open to experimenting and trying products that you actually enjoy. There's something out there you enjoy, and I think it's probably UCAN, but that's just me.
Amazing. Well, thank you guys so much. It was really fantastic to have everyone here together. Really learned a lot. Like, as much as we talk about this stuff, when kind of pair all of you guys together and I hear you talking about your different experience, it triggers things in my mind that I hadn't thought about before. So thanks to all of you. Thanks to your audience. I've still got 150 plus strong here in the room. So we're really happy about that. For everybody that's been asking, we will have a full recording of this on our YouTube channel. Just give it a couple hours. You'll be getting a full recording via email. So I know many people said they joined late or they need to listen to this back again to take notes, which we appreciate all of that. So just hang tight. You'll be getting a link to this recording in the next couple hours. But Bob, Greg, Dakotah, thank you all so much. Look forward to seeing each of you guys. Well, Greg and Dakotah, I'll see you both in Boston. Bob, I got to make a trip to Colorado to come see you sometime
Please.
soon, but look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.